Happy Friday! We have a lot to discuss in today's video, so let's real quick do a recap of what we've learned so far this week. In 1763, France finally surrendered its land in North America after fighting with Great Britain in what we call the French and Indian War. With this victory, Great Britain now had the ability to move west past their 13 original colonies. But not so fast! Because the colonists kept fighting with the Native Americans, King George announced the Proclamation of 1763 and severely limited the colonists' space. Then, on top of that, Parliament, which is Great Britain's government, made the decision to pass the Quartering Act, which meant that by law, colonists had to let the British soldiers stay in their houses in exchange for mostly unwanted protection. Today we're going to add yet another British blunder to this dumpster fire that the colonists are having to deal with. If you've ever tried to look up an image on Google, you might have come up with a couple pictures that look like this. This is a really cool picture, but there's something off about it. Any guesses? Okay, that was sounding a little too much like Dora the Explorer. It's obvious that this picture was taken by a company called Shutterstock. And you can tell because its name is plastered all over this picture. This big distracting thing is what we call a watermark, and its function is to prevent people from using the picture without the company being recognized in some way. The reason I bring this up is because in today's video we're going to be talking about a move that Great Britain tried to make using this similar concept except with much greater consequences, much to the colonists' annoyance. Let's dive into the text.
After fighting the French and Indian War, Great Britain needed money to pay its debts. In 1765, to raise money, Parliament passed a new tax law called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act said that the colonists had to pay a tax on printed papers. Newspapers, pamphlets, marriage license, and playing cards were taxed. When a colonist paid the tax, an official would mark the printed paper with a large stamp.
So when a colonist bought just about anything made of paper, they got one of these bad boys stamped on it and were charged extra. After everything we've learned so far, you'd have to assume that the colonists probably didn't like this. And you'd be right.
This new tax angered the colonists for multiple reasons. They did not want to pay more money for things they used every day, and they also did not want to pay another tax to the British government. But they were mostly angry because they had no say in making the law. They said that this taxation without representation was unfair.
So yeah, things aren't going over well for our colonists. Remember from yesterday's video that money was already a rarity, and now colonists are being asked to spend even more on things that they use every single day. But what I really want to point out here is this concept of taxation without representation. We'll dive deeper into this topic later in the video, but at a glance, this phrase means that the colonists were being taxed without having a representative in the British government. Essentially, they didn't get to voice their opinions when new rules got passed, and they let Great Britain know how they felt about it.
Colonists showed their anger in many ways. Some colonists refused to buy the stamps, while others protested in the streets and town squares. And some tried to scare off the tax collectors. At times, groups of colonists even attacked the tax collectors and their homes. Groups from different colonies joined together in protest against the Stamp Act, and in some colonies, merchants agreed not to buy any British goods. Many women, such as the Daughters of Liberty in Rhode Island, refused to buy British cloth. They wove their own cloth instead.
As you can see, the colonists are starting to take action against these unpopular moves that Parliament is making. The ones we just read about were fairly small, but in 1765, the colonists took their first big step toward making a change.
In October 1765, 9 colonies sent delegates to a special gathering in New York. This meeting became known as the Stamp Act Congress. The delegates thought that all British subjects had a right to vote on taxes through representatives. But the colonies had no representatives in Parliament, so the delegates said that it was unfair for Parliament to pass tax laws like the Stamp Act. To them, such laws were an example of taxation without representation.
There is a lot to unpack here. First of all, a delegate is defined as a person who represents a group at a convention or a conference. So these 9 people got together in New York and decided that all British people, which at the time includes the colonists, had the right to vote on ideas that Parliament came up with. Unfortunately, the colonists didn't have anybody in Parliament to represent them. So these 9 delegates decided that it was unfair for Parliament to make laws that affected colonists. And this is where the concept of taxation without representation comes into play. Using a smaller version of this concept, think about your classes at PE. The PE teachers inform you that you guys are the ones that get to decide which games you play. Well, let's say that one of the 3 classes is still inside and hasn't made it out yet. And while they're still gone, the 2 other classes make the decision about what games you're playing without the 3rd class getting a chance to share their opinions. If you're a part of the 3rd class, you might be feeling pretty upset about this decision. And this is exactly how the colonists felt. Because they don't have a representative in Parliament, they feel like they're not being heard. And as a result, you can see why they would protest in anger. And speaking of protests, we probably aren't surprised at the way the colonists acted, but you know who was? Old Georgie himself.
The colonists' angry protests surprised King George III and Parliament. However, British leaders knew that they could not force the colonists to obey the Stamp Act. In March 1766, Parliament repealed the law, but Parliament let the colonies know that it still believed in its right to tax them.
So isn't it interesting that Parliament knew that this was unfair and yet they still did it? If you haven't already, now you can see why the colonists were so annoyed about this. And look at that, Parliament listened and repealed, which means cancelled, the law that they made in 1766. They finally made a smart choice. But sometimes people, and in this case Parliament, just can't leave well enough alone.
In 1767, Parliament again passed tax laws to raise money from the colonies. These laws, called the Townsend Act, taxed several goods that the colonies imported. These goods included lead, glass, paint, paper, and tea. In protest, the colonists again stopped buying British goods.
They just had to get in their own way, didn't they? They were so close to making peace with the colonists, but they couldn't last even 1 year before they rolled out a new set of taxes for the colonists to pay. And you know what? This time, it made the colonists really mad. In fact, they did much more than just stop buying the British products. But we'll save that tea for another video. Real quick before we wrap up today's video, let's fill in our notes and compare the Stamp Act to our modern day example. When it says that the principal requires that your class pay to use basketballs during recess, the historical equivalent is that Great Britain passes a law that makes colonists pay a tax on printed items. And as we learned today, the colonists weren't too happy about that. So when the students in our modern day example are upset, this translates to the colonists protest against taxation without representation. Guys, that's going to do it for today's daily dose of history. I'm trying something new in our Google Classroom, and you may have noticed it already before you clicked on this video. I'm including the question of the day in the same post as this video, so it should be right there all in one easy place for you to locate. Also, with the end of this video, that marks the end of week 1 of our online learning experience. And with that being said, today we're finally having our first Zoom discussion. So before the video ends, make sure you double check this time chart here and make sure you hop on at the right time so you can join the discussion with your class. And with that being said, have a great weekend, and I'll see you right here on Monday.